The teacup shattered against the Duke's chest like a small porcelain explosion, sending a cascade of hot Earl Grey across the front of his dove gray waistcoat and down onto trousers that probably cost more than Marin earned in a year. The sound it made, that delicate, expensive crack followed by the splash of liquid against fine wool, seemed to echo through the drawing room with the weight of a cathedral bell. Marin stood frozen, the empty saucer still balanced on her trembling fingers, watching the dark stain spread across his clothing like a map of her ruined future. Around her, the room had gone deathly silent. 14 guests seated at the afternoon gathering of Lord and Lady Ashworth turned as one to witness the catastrophe. Spoons hovered above teacups. Conversations died mid-syllable. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling, as if the entire house had drawn a collective breath and held it. She had been in service at Ashworth Manor for exactly 11 days. 11 days of learning which silver went where, which guests preferred cream, which hallways to avoid after dark. 11 days of Mrs. Calder, the housekeeper, drilling into her that the drawing room service was the single most important duty a junior maid could be trusted with, and that any girl who couldn't manage a teacup had no business being in a respectable house. And now the tea was on the Duke. Not just any Duke. Hadrian Voss, the 6th Duke of Ashenmere, a man so famously silent that London society had spent the better part of 2 years speculating whether he'd taken a private vow of silence following his wife's death. He attended events. He stood in rooms. He occupied space with the gravity of a man carved from marble. But he did not speak. Not to hostesses. Not to politicians. Not to the endless parade of women his mother pushed in his direction. The silent Duke, they called him, behind gloved hands and fluttering fans. The ghost of Ashenmere, and Marin had just baptized him in Earl Grey. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her mind screamed at her to apologize, to curtsy, to do something other than stand there like a deer caught in lantern light. But her body had divorced itself from rational thought. She could feel Mrs. Calder's gaze burning into the back of her skull from the doorway. She could hear Lady Ashworth's sharp intake of breath. She could see, with horrifying clarity, a single tea leaf clinging to the Duke's lapel like a tiny dark flag of surrender. He looked down at his ruined waistcoat. Then he looked up at her. His eyes were gray. Not the warm gray of morning clouds or the soft gray of dove feathers, but the hard, still gray of lake water in winter. Eyes that assessed without revealing, that watched without inviting. His face was angular and lean, framed by dark hair that had been cut with military precision. He was perhaps 35, though grief had carved lines around his mouth that made him seem older, or perhaps just tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Marin waited for the explosion, for the cold fury that men of his station wielded like a weapon. She'd seen it before at her previous position. Lord Thurston sacking a footman for scuffing his boots, Lady Deverell dismissing a cook for oversalting the soup. The powerful destroyed the powerless for lesser offenses than this. It was simply how the world worked. But the Duke of Ashenmere did something she did not expect. He rose to his feet. Not in anger. Not with the sharp, violent motion of a man preparing to deliver punishment. He stood slowly, deliberately, with the contained grace of someone who measured every movement before committing to it. The tea dripped from his waistcoat onto the carpet. The room held its breath even tighter, if such a thing were possible. Lady Ashworth half rose from her chair, her face cycling through horror and social calculation at alarming speed. And then the Duke did something that no one in that room, least of all Marin, could have predicted. He picked up his napkin, pressed it calmly against his chest, and turned to the gathered company. "The tea," he said, his voice low and rough, as though it had gone unused for so long that the words had to fight their way out, was too hot. The fault is with the preparation, not the service. 14 mouths fell open simultaneously. Lady Ashworth sat back down so hard her chair scraped against the floor. Lord Ashworth choked on a biscuit, because the Duke of Ashenmere had just spoken, in public, for the first time in anyone's recent memory, and he had spoken to defend a clumsy maid who'd just ruined his afternoon. Marin's knees buckled. She locked them through sheer will, gripping the empty saucer so hard she thought it might crack as well. The Duke's gaze returned to her, and for a fraction of a moment, something passed through those winter-gray eyes. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, as if he'd seen something in her frozen terror that interested him. Then Mrs. Calder was at her elbow, fingers digging into her arm with the force of barely suppressed fury. "Come with me," the housekeeper hissed. "Now." Marin was pulled from the room like a disgraced soldier dragged from a battlefield. Behind her, she heard conversation resume in a rush of whispered scandal. The Duke of Ashenmere had spoken. A maid had spilled tea on the most reclusive man in England, and instead of having her dismissed, he'd blamed the tea. The gossip would spread through London like wildfire. By morning, every drawing room in Mayfair would know. And Marin, trembling in the servants' corridor with Mrs. Calder's lecture ringing in her ears, had no idea that the man whose silence she'd accidentally shattered was already forming a plan that would change both their lives entirely. Mrs. Calder's office smelled of beeswax and disappointment. Marin stood before the housekeeper's desk with her hands clasped behind her back, studying a knot in the wooden floor while her future unraveled in crisp, efficient sentences. 11 days, Mrs. Calder said, each word a nail in a coffin. 11 days, and you've managed to assault a duke with a teacup. I didn't assault him, Mrs. Calder. I tripped on the carpet edge and... The result is the same. Tea. On a duke, in front of 14 guests, including Lady Ashworth, who specifically requested that this afternoon proceed without incident, because the Duke of Ashenmere has refused every invitation she's extended for 18 months, and she wanted... Mrs. Calder stopped herself, pressing her fingers to her temples. It doesn't matter what she wanted. Pack your things. I'll have your wages sent. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Pack your things. Just like that, 11 days of desperate, careful work, erased by a wrinkled carpet edge, and bad luck. Mrs. Calder, please, if you'd let me apologize to His Grace directly, perhaps apologize to the Duke of Ashenmere? You'll do no such thing. The man hasn't willingly spoken to anyone in 2 years, and the fact that he chose to speak today, to defend you of all people, is a miracle I have no intention of testing twice. You'll leave quietly before you cause any further. A knock at the door interrupted her, not the tentative knock of a fellow servant, but the single, authoritative rap of someone accustomed to doors opening immediately. Mrs. Calder straightened, as if pulled by strings. Come in. The door opened, and a man entered whom Marin didn't recognize. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the bearing of someone important, but not titled. A secretary or steward, she guessed, by the leather folio he carried, and the precise way he positioned himself just inside the threshold. Mrs. Calder, His Grace the Duke of Ashenmere requests a word with the young woman who served the tea. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Mrs. Calder's expression traveled through surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally settled on a strained deference that looked physically painful. Mr. Pemberton, I assure you, the girl is being dealt with. There's no need for His Grace to trouble himself. His Grace was quite specific. He'd like to speak with her in Lord Ashworth's study. Immediately! Mrs. Calder looked at Marin as though she'd sprouted a second head. Marin looked at Mr. Pemberton, who betrayed nothing. His face was professional courtesy made flesh. "Go," Mrs. Calder said tightly. "And for heaven's sake, don't spill anything else on him." Marin followed Mr. Pemberton through corridors she hadn't yet learned, her heart beating so violently she was certain he could hear it. The study was on the first floor, a dark-paneled room with hunting prints and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco. The Duke stood by the window, his ruined waistcoat replaced by a fresh one, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man examining something only he could see. Mr. Pemberton withdrew and closed the door. They were alone. Marin curtsied, though her legs felt unreliable. "Your Grace, I owe you the most sincere apology. My conduct was inexcusable, and What is your name?" His voice was the same as before. Low, rough, reluctant, as if each word cost him something. "Marin, Your Grace. Marin Lindell. How long have you been in service here?" 11 days, Your Grace. "And before that?" She hesitated. "I was a lady's maid at Thurston Park in Wiltshire. Before that, I was with the Deverell household in Bath." "2 positions in how many years?" 3 years, Your Grace." She swallowed. "I can provide references for both." "I don't need your references, Miss Lindell. I need your help." The words were so unexpected that Marin briefly wondered if the tea had somehow damaged his mind rather than his clothing. "My help, Your Grace?" He turned from the window. In the afternoon light, his face was less severe than it had appeared in the drawing room, but no less guarded. He studied her with the same assessing stillness she'd seen earlier, as if she were a document written in a language he was deciding whether to learn. "My mother has spent the last 2 years attempting to find me a new wife. She's arranged introductions, engineered social encounters, and invited every eligible woman between here and Edinburgh to dine with me. I've refused them all by the simple method of not speaking. If I don't engage, they can't advance their cause." Marin said nothing, because nothing she could think to say seemed remotely appropriate. "Today you spilled tea on me, and I spoke. By tomorrow morning, every gossip in London will know. My mother will interpret this as progress. She'll redouble her efforts. Within a week, I'll have a new parade of candidates at my door, each one more determined than the last." "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to break my silence, I know. But you did. And now, I need to manage the consequences." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words with the precision of a man placing stones on a scale. "I need someone to occupy the position my mother is trying to fill, temporarily. Someone who can stand beside me at events, deflect the candidates, convince my mother that I've made a choice, so she'll stop trying to make one for me." The room tilted. Marin gripped the back of a chair. "You're asking me to pretend to be Your Grace, I'm a maid." "You were a maid. As of 10 minutes ago, Mrs. Calder dismissed you." His expression didn't change, but something in his voice shifted, a thread of dark practicality. "You need a position. I need a shield. This arrangement would serve us both." "This is madness." "Possibly. But you're the only person who's made me speak in 2 years. My mother will find that fact irresistible. She'll believe it even if no one else does." He let the words settle between them, heavy and strange. Marin stared at him. This silent, grief-hollowed Duke who was offering her something that sounded like either salvation or catastrophe, and she genuinely could not tell which. "I need time to think," she said. "You have until morning. Mr. Pemberton will arrange a room for you tonight. If you decline, I'll ensure you leave with a full quarter's wages and a letter of reference. If you accept," he paused, "we'll discuss terms." He turned back to the window, signaling the conversation was over. Marin left the study on unsteady legs, her mind reeling, and nearly collided with a young woman waiting in the corridor outside. The young woman caught Marin by the shoulders, before they both toppled. She was perhaps 20, with auburn hair escaping its pins in every direction and a face that radiated the kind of uncontainable energy that made rooms feel smaller. Her dress was expensive, but worn carelessly, a shawl trailing from one shoulder, ink stains on her fingers. "You're the tea girl," she said, and her smile was enormous. "Oh, thank God. I've been waiting out here for 20 minutes hoping he wouldn't frighten you off. I'm Sybil Voss, the difficult sister." Marin blinked. "Lady Sybil, Just Sybil, please. Lady Sybil makes me sound like someone who embroiders and faints, and I do neither." She looped her arm through Marin's as if they'd known each other for years and began walking. "He told you the plan, didn't he? The pretend courtship scheme? He's terrible at explaining things. He probably made it sound like a military operation. He made it sound like a transaction. Of course he did. That's all he knows anymore. Transactions, accounts, estate management. Since Gemma died, he's turned himself into a machine. Wind him up, point him at a ledger, and watch him work until midnight. Repeat." Sybil's voice was light, but beneath it ran a current of real pain. "He used to be different, you know. Before. He used to laugh. He played piano. Badly, but enthusiastically. He once spent an entire afternoon teaching our dog to shake hands, and considered it the finest accomplishment of his week." Marin tried to reconcile this image with the granite-faced man in the study. She couldn't. "What happened to his wife?" she asked quietly. Sybil's brightness dimmed. "Fever. It took her in 3 days. He was with her for every moment. And when it was over, he just stopped. Stopped talking. Stopped engaging. Stopped being Hadrian. He became the Duke full-time, as if the man inside had packed up and left, and only the title remained." They'd reached a small sitting room at the end of the corridor. Sybil pulled her inside and closed the door with conspiratorial urgency. "Our mother is Lady Philippa Voss. She's formidable in the way that natural disasters are formidable. Unavoidable, unstoppable, and convinced she's acting in everyone's best interest, while she flattens everything in her path. She's decided Hadrian needs a new wife. Specifically, she's decided he needs Lady Cordelia Fane." "Who is Lady Cordelia Fane?" "Beautiful, wealthy, connected to half the peerage, also the most calculating woman I've ever met, and I once watched a chess master play 12 simultaneous matches. Cordelia doesn't want Hadrian. She wants the title, the houses, the influence. She'd marry a scarecrow if it came with a dukedom." Marin sank into a chair. "And your brother wants me to stand in her way. My brother wants someone real, someone who isn't performing for a coronet. He just doesn't know that's what he wants, because he's forgotten what real feels like." Sybil knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "I know this is terrifying. I know it sounds impossible. A maid pretending to be a duke's interest? It's the plot of a bad novel. But Marin, you made him speak. Do you understand what that means? 2 years. 2 years of silence, and you cracked it with a teacup. That's not nothing. That's not an accident. It was absolutely an accident. The tea was an accident. What happened after wasn't. He chose to speak. He chose to defend you. He chose to bring you to that study instead of letting Mrs. Calder throw you out." Sybil squeezed her hands. "Say yes. Stay 1 month. If it's terrible, I'll personally escort you to whatever position you want with the finest reference letter Debrett's has ever seen. But give him a chance. Give this a chance." Marin looked at this fierce, ink-stained girl who loved her brother enough to ambush strangers in hallways, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The dangerous, reckless pull of hope. "I haven't said yes yet," she whispered. Sybil grinned. "You haven't said no either. That's practically a commitment. Marin didn't sleep. She lay in the small guest room Mr. Pemberton had arranged, staring at the ceiling, running the Duke's proposition through her mind like thread through a loom, examining it from every angle for the flaw she knew was there. By dawn, she'd found it. Not a flaw in his plan, but in the balance of power. He needed her, but the arrangement as he'd described it left her with nothing when it ended. A maid who'd spent a month pretending to be a duke's romantic interest would be unhireable. Too scandalous for respectable houses, too common for society. She'd fall through the gap between worlds and land nowhere. She dressed in her plain gray dress, the only one she owned that wasn't a uniform, and asked Mr. Pemberton to take her to the Duke. She found him in Lord Ashworth's study again, standing in the same position by the window, as if he hadn't moved all night. Perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps sleeplessness was something else they shared. "I have conditions," she said, before he could speak. Before courtesy or deference could soften her resolve. His eyebrow lifted fractionally. It was, she was learning, his version of surprise. "You've decided to accept?" "I've decided to negotiate. There's a difference." He turned fully from the window. In the early light, he looked less like marble and more like a man who carried too much and rested too little. "Go on." "First, my family. I have a younger sister, Nessa, who works as a seamstress in Cheapside. She's 16 and alone. I want her brought somewhere safe for the duration of this arrangement. Not your household. Somewhere independent, a respectable boarding house paid in advance. That can be arranged. Second, when this ends, I don't return to being a maid. You provide me with letters of introduction, not as a servant, but as a companion. Your sister's companion, specifically. Genuine references that will open doors to a position with stability and dignity. I won't go backward." He studied her. "You've thought this through carefully." "I've been thinking since 3 in the morning, Your Grace. Desperation sharpens the mind considerably." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "And your third condition?" "Honesty. If at any point during this arrangement you develop genuine interest in someone, whether it's Lady Cordelia or any other woman, you tell me immediately. I won't be the last to know. I won't stand in a ballroom smiling while everyone else whispers about how the Duke's little project didn't realize she'd been replaced." The silence stretched between them. Marin's heart hammered, but she held his gaze. She had nothing. No title. No fortune. No leverage, except the fact that he needed her more than she needed him. It was a slim advantage, but she intended to use every inch of it. "You negotiate like someone accustomed to having nothing to lose," he said. "I negotiate like someone who's lost enough to know what losing looks like. I won't be careless with what's left." Hadrian crossed the room to the desk, picked up a pen, and wrote 3 lines on a sheet of paper. He signed it, blotted the ink, and held it out to her. "Your sister will be settled by end of day. Mr. Pemberton will handle the arrangements. The reference letters will be written when our association concludes. And you have my word on the third condition." He paused. "I don't lie, Miss Lindell. I simply don't speak. There's a significant difference." Marin took the paper. His handwriting was precise and angular, like everything else about him. 3 promises in black ink, signed by a duke. "Then we have an agreement," she said. "We do." He extended his hand. Not the way a duke offered his hand to a lady, graceful and performative. He offered it the way one person offered it to another, when a bargain had been struck, and both parties understood the weight of it. She shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and he held it for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before releasing it. "Mr. Pemberton will begin preparations," he said, turning back to the window. "We leave for Ashenmere Hall tomorrow." Marin walked out of the study with a signed promise in her hand, and the vertiginous feeling of someone who'd just stepped off a cliff and hadn't yet looked down. Ashenmere Hall announced itself long before the carriage reached its gates. The road narrowed through a corridor of ancient oaks, their branches knitting together overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a green cathedral. And then the trees fell away, and the house appeared across a sweep of manicured parkland, as if it had been placed there by a painter who understood exactly how to make a building look like it owned the earth beneath it. It was enormous, not merely large in the way that wealthy homes were large, but vast in a manner that suggested the family who built it had been trying to make a philosophical point about permanence. Pale stone walls stretched in both directions, punctuated by tall windows that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in sheets of gold. A central portico with columns rose above a gravel drive, where two carriages could have passed side by side without touching. Beyond the main house, wings extended like arms, reaching toward formal gardens that disappeared into the distance. Marin pressed her face to the carriage window and felt something between wonder and nausea. "It's absurd, isn't it?" Sybil said cheerfully from the opposite seat. 47 rooms. I counted once when I was 12. Got lost twice and had to be rescued by a footman. There's an entire wing no one's entered in 6 years. Father used to joke that the house was too large for people and ought to be given to the deer. Hadrian sat beside his sister, silent as ever, his gaze fixed on the approaching house with an expression Marin couldn't read. Duty, perhaps, or the particular weariness of a man returning to a place that held more ghosts than comfort. The carriage stopped. Servants materialized in a line so precise it looked rehearsed, which it almost certainly was. A butler with the bearing of a retired admiral descended the front steps and opened the carriage door with gloved hands. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Lady Sybil." His eyes found Marin and performed a rapid, invisible calculation. "And welcome to Ashenmere Hall, miss." "This is Miss Lindell," Sybil announced, before Hadrian could speak. "She's my new companion, and she's wonderful. And I need her settled in the blue rooms immediately, because we have an enormous amount to do before Mother arrives on Thursday." Thursday. 3 days to transform a dismissed housemaid into someone who could survive the scrutiny of Lady Philippa Voss. Marin's stomach clenched. The interior of Ashenmere was no less overwhelming than the exterior. Marble floors gave way to polished oak. Portraits of Voss ancestors lined a gallery that seemed to stretch into the past itself. Every surface gleamed. Every arrangement of flowers looked effortlessly perfect. Every piece of furniture whispered of generations of accumulated wealth and taste. Marin followed Sybil through corridors that smelled of beeswax and lavender, past drawing rooms and music rooms, and a library whose doors stood open to reveal walls of books rising 2 stories high. She caught a glimpse of Hadrian peeling away toward a study at the back of the house, already reaching for a stack of correspondence that a footman held waiting, retreating into work, just as Sybil had described. The blue rooms were on the 2nd floor, overlooking the east gardens. Marin stopped in the doorway and stared. A bedroom with a canopied bed draped in pale blue silk, an adjoining sitting room with its own writing desk and a small bookcase already stocked, a dressing room with a wardrobe that could swallow every garment she'd ever owned and still echo with emptiness. "This is larger than the house I grew up in," she said quietly. "Is it?" Sybil flopped onto the bed with complete disregard for propriety. "I suppose I've never thought about it. That's the problem with growing up in a place like this. You lose perspective entirely. Hadrian's rooms are in the west wing. Mother's are on the floor above. Mine are just down the corridor. So if you need anything at night, just knock." A young maid appeared with a curtsy. "Miss, I'm Darcy. I've been assigned to attend you during your stay. Lady Sybil has sent word to her dressmaker in the village. She'll arrive tomorrow morning for measurements." Measurements. Dresses. The blue rooms. A lady's maid assigned to a maid. The absurdity pressed against Marin's ribs like laughter she couldn't afford to release. "Thank you, Darcy," she managed. When the maid left, Sybil sat up, suddenly serious. "I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand something before Thursday. Mother isn't like Hadrian. She doesn't go silent when she's grieving. She plans. She controls. She rearranges the world until it matches the picture in her head. And right now, the picture in her head is Hadrian married to Cordelia Fane by Christmas. What if she sees through this immediately? She might. She's terrifyingly perceptive. But here's what works in our favor." Sybil leaned forward. "Hadrian spoke for you, publicly, in front of witnesses. Mother has been praying for him to speak again for 2 years. When she hears that a woman made him break his silence, she won't be able to resist investigating. She'll want to understand why. That curiosity is our doorway. And if she decides she doesn't like what she finds," Sybil's expression flickered, "then we improvise. But Marin, listen to me. Whatever happens with Mother, whatever happens with this arrangement, don't pretend to be someone you're not. Don't try to act like a lady or mimic society manners. Just be yourself. Your real self is what made him speak. Anything else will ring false, and Mother can detect false the way dogs detect foxes." Marin moved to the window. The east garden stretched below, geometrically precise hedgerows giving way to wilder growth at the edges. In the distance, she could see a lake, its surface catching the last light of afternoon. Somewhere in this vast, beautiful house, a silent duke was burying himself in paperwork to avoid feeling anything. Somewhere beyond these grounds, a formidable mother was preparing to arrive and reclaim control of her son's future. And somewhere in between, Marin Lindell, a dismissed housemaid, with ink-stained references and a signed promise in her pocket, was standing in blue silk rooms, trying to remember how to breathe. 3 days until Lady Philippa. 3 days to become someone convincing. Or perhaps, she thought, remembering Sybil's advice, 3 days to figure out how being exactly who she already was could possibly be enough. Lady Philippa Voss arrived on Thursday at precisely 2 o'clock, because Lady Philippa did nothing imprecisely. Her carriage was black and immaculate. Her traveling dress was charcoal gray, unadorned except for a cameo at her throat that looked like it had been handed down through several generations of women who did not tolerate nonsense. She was taller than Marin expected, straight-backed and sharp-featured, with silver threading through dark hair that she wore pulled back in a style that made no concessions to softness. She entered Ashenmere Hall the way a general enters a command post, surveying, assessing, and cataloging everything that had changed in her absence, and everything that hadn't changed, but should have. Sybil greeted her with a kiss on each cheek and a stream of chatter designed to create a buffer zone. Hadrian stood in the entrance hall, hands behind his back, and submitted to his mother's embrace with the stillness of a man enduring a necessary procedure. "You look thin," Lady Philippa said, holding him at arm's length, "and tired. Are you sleeping?" "I'm well, Mother." 3 words. More than he usually offered, Marin gathered from Sybil's barely concealed excitement. Lady Philippa's eyes narrowed, processing this unexpected verbal output with visible interest. Then her gaze found Marin. It was like being examined by a jeweler, not with hostility, but with the penetrating focus of someone trained to distinguish genuine stones from glass. Marin felt every thread of her borrowed morning dress, every pin in her carefully arranged hair, every gap in the fiction she was supposed to embody. "And this must be the young woman," Lady Philippa said. "Not a question. Miss Marin Lindell," Sybil said brightly. "My companion. I told you about her in my letter." "You told me remarkably little in your letter, which in itself told me a great deal." Lady Philippa extended her hand. Marin took it. The older woman's grip was cool and assessing. "Walk with me, Miss Lindell. I'd like to see the gardens." It wasn't a request. Sybil moved to follow, but her mother stopped her with a single raised finger. "Alone, Sybil." The gardens were immaculate, every hedge trimmed, every gravel path raked. Lady Philippa walked in silence for a full 2 minutes, which Marin understood was deliberate, a test of nerves. Could the girl tolerate silence, or would she rush to fill it with anxious chatter? Marin walked beside her and said nothing. She'd spent 2 years working in households where silence was a servant's primary skill. She could outwait anyone. Finally, Lady Philippa spoke. "My son has not voluntarily spoken in public for nearly 2 years. Last week, he spoke to defend a maid who spilled tea on him. 3 days ago, he brought that same maid to his family home and installed her in the blue guest rooms. His sister has appointed her as a companion, commissioned new dresses for her, and written me a letter so aggressively casual that it practically screamed deception." She stopped walking and faced Marin directly. "So, which part of this performance would you like to explain first?" Marin's pulse hammered, but she kept her voice level. "All of it, your ladyship. I'd rather you heard the truth from me than assembled it from gossip." Something shifted in Lady Philippa's expression, not approval, but the faintest crack in her assessment. "Go on." So Marin told her, not the rehearsed version Sybil had coached her on, but the truth. The tea, the dismissal, the Duke's proposition in the study, the arrangement, the conditions she'd negotiated, the frank reality that she was a servant playing a role in exchange for references and her sister's safety. Lady Philippa listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing. When Marin finished, the older woman resumed walking, her pace slower now, contemplative. "You're remarkably candid for someone in your position," Lady Philippa said. "Lying to you seemed pointless, your ladyship. You'd have found the truth within a day, and then I'd be both dishonest and dismissed." "You're correct. I would have." Lady Philippa paused beside a stone bench, but didn't sit. "Do you know why I want my son to marry Miss Lindell?" Lady Sybil mentioned duty, the title, an heir. Sybil is a romantic who reduces everything to narrative. The truth is simpler and uglier. Lady Philippa's voice dropped, not in volume, but in temperature. "My son is dying. Not physically. Physically, he's as strong as his father was. But inside, he's been hollowing himself out since Gemma's death. He fills the empty spaces with work, with silence, with the performance of duty. And every month, there's a little less of him left." She turned to Marin, and for the first time, the controlled mask slipped. Underneath was a mother's fear, raw and undecorated. "I watched my son hold his wife's hand for 3 days while fever consumed her. I watched him sit beside her body for 6 hours after she was gone, because he couldn't accept that the hand he was holding would never squeeze back. And then I watched him stand up, button his coat, and become the Duke. He hasn't unbuttoned since." Marin's throat ached. "I'm sorry, your ladyship. I don't want your sympathy. Miss Lindell, I want to understand what you are. Are you an opportunist? A fortune hunter wrapped in a convincing performance of humility? Or are you genuinely what you appear to be, a frightened young woman who stumbled into something she doesn't understand? I'm a dismissed housemaid who needs employment and whose sister needs safety. Your son offered both in exchange for a temporary performance. That's the entirety of it." "Is it?" Lady Philippa's gaze sharpened. "Because my son spoke for you. He hasn't spoken for anyone. Not for me, not for Sybil. Not for the grief counselors or the physicians or the parade of suitable women I've placed in his path. But a clumsy maid with a teacup accomplished what 2 years of love and strategy could not. That is not nothing, Miss Lindell. That is either a miracle or a very clever manipulation, and I need to know which." The words struck with surgical precision. Marin felt each one land, felt the weight of this woman's desperate love for her son pressing against her like a physical force. "I don't know why he spoke," Marin said honestly. "I was as surprised as everyone else. Perhaps more so, because I was the one holding the empty saucer." Lady Philippa stared at her for a long, breathless moment. Then, impossibly, the corner of her mouth twitched. "Sybil tells me you have spine. I see she wasn't exaggerating." She began walking back toward the house. "I will be watching you, Miss Lindell. Every moment, every interaction, every word you exchange with my son. If I determine that you are genuine, I will tolerate this arrangement. If I determine that you are not." She let the sentence hang, unfinished and more threatening for its absence of specifics. "I understand, your ladyship. One more thing." Lady Philippa stopped at the garden door. "Lady Cordelia Fane arrives next week for a house visit I arranged before any of this began. I will not cancel her visit. If my son's conviction in this little arrangement of yours can't survive the presence of a real candidate, then it was never worth protecting in the first place." She swept inside, leaving Marin alone in the garden with the scent of cut roses and the sickening realization that the stakes had just doubled. Lady Cordelia was coming, and this fragile fiction Marin had agreed to inhabit was about to be tested by the one person most motivated to tear it apart. The days before Lady Cordelia's arrival settled into a rhythm that Marin hadn't expected. Quiet, domestic, almost peaceful. Sybil filled the mornings with walks and conversation, teaching her the geography of the estate, the names of the tenant families, the history embedded in every stone and hedgerow. But it was the evenings that changed things. It began accidentally, as most important things seemed to in Marin's life. She'd gone to the library after dinner, drawn by the promise of solitude and the 2-story walls of books she'd been too intimidated to explore. She expected to be alone. She found Hadrian instead. He sat in a leather chair by the fire, not reading, not working, simply sitting with a glass of untouched brandy and the vacant stare of a man whose thoughts were somewhere far less comfortable than his surroundings. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the instinctive withdrawal begin, the straightening of posture, the reassembly of the controlled mask. "I can leave," she said. "Stay." The word came out quickly, as if he'd said it before the mask could fully form. He seemed surprised by it himself. "If you'd like. The library is large enough for 2. So she stayed. She selected a volume of Keats from a lower shelf and settled into the opposite chair, and they read in silence for an hour. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt like the first truly restful hour Marin had experienced since arriving at Ashenmere. The next evening she returned. He was there again. This time he spoke first. "You chose Keats last night. You noticed." "I notice most things. Speaking about them is the part I've abandoned." He set aside the estate ledger he'd been reviewing. "Did you enjoy it?" "Very much, though some of the poems feel almost too beautiful, like staring directly at the sun. Gemma said something similar once." The words escaped him before he could catch them. She watched his jaw tighten, the familiar retreat beginning. But this time, instead of shutting down completely, he paused, held himself at the edge of silence rather than falling into it. She preferred Shelley, said Keats made her cry too easily. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife voluntarily. Marin understood instinctively that acknowledging the significance of this would destroy it. So she simply said, "Shelley is wonderful too. But I've always thought crying over poetry was rather the point." Something loosened in his expression. Not a smile. She wasn't sure he remembered how. but a release of tension, like a fist slowly unclenching. They talked. Not about the arrangement or his mother or Lady Cordelia, about books, about poetry, about the way certain words could hold emotions too large for ordinary conversation. He spoke haltingly at first, each sentence extracted with visible effort, but as the fire burned lower, the pauses between his words shortened. His voice lost some of its rough, disused quality and began to sound like what it must have been before grief had silenced it. Warm, thoughtful, unexpectedly dry. "You read widely for a housemaid," he observed, not unkindly. "My father was a schoolteacher before his health failed. He believed books were the only inheritance worth leaving. Every penny he could spare went to second-hand volumes. Our parlor had more books than furniture." He sounds like a man of good priorities. He was. He is. He just can't hold a book steady anymore. His hands shake too badly. I read to him on my days off when I can get home. She paused. When I had days off. The silence that followed was different from Hadrian's usual silences. This one had texture, recognition, understanding, the shared weight of watching a parent diminish. "What happened to him?" Hadrian asked, a tremor that started in his fingers and spread. "The physicians can't stop it. He was the finest penman in our village, could write in a hand, so beautiful people mistook it for printing. Now he can't sign his own name." Marin stared into the fire. "That's the cruelest part. Not the pain. The erasure. Watching the thing that defined him disappear piece by piece." When she looked up, Hadrian was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Open. Unguarded. As if her words had reached past the Duke and found the man Sybil remembered. "I understand erasure," he said quietly. They sat with that shared understanding between them, and Marin felt the boundary of their arrangement flex and blur, like a line drawn in sand that the tide was slowly approaching. On the third evening, she found a book on her chair when she arrived, a leather-bound collection of Shelley with a folded note tucked inside. The handwriting was precise and angular, since you believe crying over poetry is the point. It was not a grand gesture. It was not romantic in any obvious way. But Marin held the book against her chest and felt something shift in her ribcage, a rearrangement of weight she hadn't authorized, a warmth settling into spaces she'd kept deliberately cold. She was in trouble. She knew it the way sailors know storms, not yet visible on the horizon, but present in the change of pressure, the shift of wind, the instinct that says everything is about to become complicated. That night, she wrote to her sister Nessa. She described the house, the gardens, the library with its impossible walls of books. She did not mention the Duke's gray eyes or the way his voice sounded when he spoke about his wife. She did not mention the Shelley or the note or the dangerous, reckless hope unfurling in her chest like a vine she couldn't prune fast enough. Some things were too fragile to survive being written down. Lady Cordelia Fane arrived on a Tuesday, and she arrived like weather, impossible to ignore, difficult to prepare for, and immediately dominant over everything in her vicinity. She was stunning. There was no honest way around it. Tall, golden-haired, with the kind of porcelain beauty that painters built careers around. She wore traveling clothes that somehow looked like evening wear, and she descended from her carriage with the serene confidence of a woman who had never once questioned whether she belonged somewhere. Marin watched from an upstairs window and felt every inadequacy she'd ever possessed line up in formation. "Don't," Sybil said, appearing beside her. "Don't compare yourself." That's exactly what she wants. She hasn't even seen me yet. She doesn't need to. Cordelia's power is atmospheric. She makes everyone around her feel insufficient just by existing. It's a talent, really. a horrible one, but a talent. The first test came at dinner. Lady Philippa had arranged the seating with strategic precision. Hadrian at the head, Cordelia to his right, Marin to his left, Sybil beside Marin as both ally and buffer. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, candles throwing warm light across faces arranged in various configurations of performance. Cordelia was charming, effortlessly, devastatingly charming. She spoke to Hadrian with the practiced ease of someone who'd studied him like a text, asking about estate improvements in a way that demonstrated knowledge without seeming aggressive, laughing at precisely the right moments, touching his arm with casual intimacy when making a point. And Hadrian responded, not with warmth, but with the mechanical courtesy of a man fulfilling social obligation. He answered her questions. He acknowledged her observations. He was, by his recent standards, almost conversational. Marin felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was what Cordelia looked like beside him. Polished, appropriate, belonging. This was the picture Lady Philippa had envisioned. It made sense in a way that Marin and Hadrian never could. "Miss Lindell," Cordelia said, turning her attention across the table with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sybil tells me you're her companion. How lovely. Where did you train?" The question was a trap, elegantly constructed. Companions were typically gentlewomen from good families who'd fallen on hard times. A trained companion had credentials, references, a pedigree. Marin had none of these, and Cordelia almost certainly knew it. "I wasn't formally trained, Lady Cordelia. Lady Sybil and I connected through mutual interests. She was kind enough to offer me the position." How unconventional. The word was a scalpel. And what mutual interests would those be? "Literature, primarily," Sybil interjected. "Marin reads more than anyone I've ever met. She's been helping me organize the library catalog. It's been in chaos since Father died." "How useful." Cordelia turned back to Hadrian. "Your Grace, I'd love to see the library. Perhaps after dinner? I remember your father's collection being extraordinary." "Miss Lindell could show you," Hadrian said. "She's become quite familiar with it." The statement landed in the middle of the table like a dropped glass. Cordelia's smile froze for a fraction of a second. Lady Philippa's eyes sharpened. Sybil kicked Marin under the table, which Marin interpreted as either excitement or warning. The evening continued, but something had shifted. Hadrian's comment had drawn a line. Subtle, possibly unconscious, but unmistakable. He'd placed Marin inside his world, and Cordelia outside it, and everyone at the table felt it. 3 days later, Lady Philippa announced a dinner party. Just neighbors and a few local families. Nothing elaborate. But nothing Lady Philippa organized was ever not elaborate. And when the evening arrived, the dining room held 30 guests, a string quartet, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. Marin wore a gown of deep amber silk that Sybil's dressmaker had created with startling speed. Darcy had arranged her dark hair with small amber pins that caught the candlelight. She looked, she thought, studying her reflection, like a convincing imitation of someone who belonged. "You look beautiful," Sybil said from the doorway. "Hadrian is going to stare and then pretend he wasn't staring. It's his signature move." Sybil was right. When Marin descended the stairs, Hadrian was waiting in the entrance hall with Cordelia beside him, both of them dressed in the kind of formal perfection that made Marin feel like a painting hung in the wrong gallery. His gaze found her, held for one unguarded moment, and then redirected to a point somewhere above her left shoulder. But she'd seen it, the flicker, the crack in the stone. The dinner proceeded with military precision. Marin was seated between a kind elderly vicar and a young baronet who talked exclusively about his horses. Across the table, Cordelia maintained her campaign with relentless grace, leaning toward Hadrian, laughing at his sparse remarks, creating an image of intimacy that photographs would have captured perfectly. After dinner, the string quartet began, and several couples moved to dance in the cleared drawing room. Cordelia turned to Hadrian, with expectation written across her perfect features. "Your Grace, shall we?" Hadrian looked at her. Then, without explanation, he crossed the room to where Marin stood by the window. "Miss Lindell, would you dance with me?" 30 people watched. Cordelia's face went blank with shock. Lady Philippa set down her teacup with a click that sounded like a gunshot. Marin took his hand. They danced, not with the polished perfection of Hadrian and Cordelia, but with something else, something unscripted and slightly imperfect that felt more honest than anything Marin had experienced in weeks. His hand at her waist was warm and steady. His eyes, usually so carefully averted, held hers. "Everyone is watching," she murmured. "I know. Cordelia looks like she wants to set fire to something. Let her." His hand tightened at her waist. "You look extraordinary tonight." Marin's breath caught. "That's considerably better than appropriate. I've been informed my compliments need work." The corner of his mouth lifted. Not a full smile, not yet, but the closest thing she'd seen, a promise that a smile existed somewhere underneath. The music ended. They separated with proper distance, but the damage was done. Every guest in the room had seen the Duke of Ashenmere choose a companion over a countess's daughter. The whispers began before Marin reached the refreshment table. Later, Cordelia found her in the corridor. "You're very clever," Cordelia said, her voice stripped of its dinner table warmth. "Playing the humble outsider while positioning yourself precisely where you want to be. I've seen this performance before, Miss Lindell. Women who use vulnerability as strategy. It works for a time. But men like the Duke don't marry women like you. They amuse themselves briefly, and then return to their obligations." "Is that what you are, Lady Cordelia? An obligation?" Cordelia's eyes hardened. "I'm his future. You're a distraction. Enjoy it while it lasts." She swept away, and Marin leaned against the wall, her pulse hammering, Cordelia's words burrowing into every insecurity she'd ever carried. A distraction. Temporary. Borrowed. The words were familiar because they were true. The conservatory at Ashenmere was glass and iron, filled with the green scent of growing things even in autumn. Marin had retreated there after the dinner party, seeking air and solitude, when she heard footsteps on the stone floor behind her. "You disappeared," Hadrian said. "I needed space." "From the party or from me?" She turned. He stood in the doorway, his formal jacket removed, his cravat loosened, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. The candlelight from the corridor behind him threw his face into sharp relief. The angular jaw, the tired eyes, the mouth that rarely smiled, but that she'd begun to watch for signs of one. "Cordelia said something to you," he said. "Not a question. Nothing I hadn't already told myself." He moved closer. "Tell me what she said. The truth. That this is temporary. That you don't marry women like me. That I'm a distraction." Marin wrapped her arms around herself. "She's right, Hadrian. About all of it." It was the first time she'd used his name. They both heard it. The sound hung between them like a struck bell, vibrating with implications neither had authorized. "She's not right," he said, his voice rough. "She's calculating and strategic, and she speaks with absolute confidence about things she doesn't understand. She understands your world better than I ever will. My world." He said it with sudden bitterness. "My world is a title I inherited, and a house full of rooms I can't enter without remembering who used to be in them. My world is silence and duty and the performance of stability, while everything underneath crumbles. Cordelia understands the performance. She doesn't understand what's underneath. And I do? You do. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. You're the only person who sat across from me in that library and not tried to fix me or manage me or steer me toward some version of recovery that looks acceptable from the outside. You just stayed. You read your poetry and let me be broken, and somehow that made me less broken than anything else has. Marin's eyes burned. Hadrian, I'm a maid. I spilled tea on you. This entire situation exists because of an accident and a wrinkled carpet edge. Maybe the best things start that way. Unplanned, uncontrolled. The opposite of everything I've been trying to maintain. You're grieving. You're lonely. What you're feeling isn't... Don't tell me what I'm feeling. His voice cracked, and the sound of it, raw, unguarded, desperate, stopped her argument cold. I have spent 2 years being told what I should feel, when I should recover, how I should move forward. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a timeline. But no one has asked me what I actually want. What do you want? She whispered. This. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. This moment. This honesty. You. He kissed her. Not the careful, measured gesture of a duke performing affection for an audience. This was unscripted and urgent, his mouth against hers, with the accumulated force of 2 years of silence breaking open at once. She tasted wine and longing and the terrifying sweetness of something neither of them had planned. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. His breathing was unsteady. His hands trembled where they held her face. This changes everything, she said. I know. I'm still scared. So am I. His thumb traced her jaw. I'm more scared than I've been since the night Gemma died, because wanting something means it can be lost. They stood there, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air, balanced on the knife edge between the arrangement they'd made and the truth they could no longer deny. Then a door opened somewhere in the house, and voices drifted toward them. Sybil's bright laughter, Lady Philippa's measured tones. They stepped apart, the space between them suddenly electric with everything that had just happened and everything that couldn't be taken back. Tomorrow, Hadrian said, we need to talk about what this means. Tomorrow, she agreed. But tomorrow, she knew, would bring Lady Philippa's sharp eyes and Cordelia's sharper tongue. Tomorrow would bring reality pressing against the fragile thing they'd just created. And Marin wasn't sure it could survive the pressure. Tomorrow didn't bring a conversation. It brought Lady Philippa. Marin was summoned to the morning room before breakfast, where she found the older woman standing by the window in the exact posture her son favored. Hands clasped, spine rigid, gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. Sit down, Miss Lindell. Marin sat. The chair felt like a witness stand. I have spent the last week observing you, Lady Philippa said without turning. Watching how you interact with my son, how you carry yourself in company, how you respond to pressure. You've performed admirably. Better than I expected for a woman of your background. Thank you, your ladyship. I wasn't finished. Lady Philippa turned, and her expression was arctic. Last night, after the dinner party, I went to the conservatory to collect a shawl I'd left there earlier in the day. The glass walls, Miss Lindell, are transparent from both directions. The blood drained from Marin's face. I see you understand. You kissed my son, or he kissed you. The distinction hardly matters. What matters is that this arrangement, which you yourself described to me as a transaction, has become something else entirely. And that something else is dangerous. Your ladyship, you are a dismissed housemaid with no fortune, no family of consequence, and no realistic place in my son's future. He is grieving, vulnerable, and desperate for connection. What you are offering him feels like salvation. But feelings are not foundations, Miss Lindell. They are weather. They change. Each word was a blade, precise and surgical. And each word found its mark because each word echoed the fears Marin had been carrying since the first evening in the library. Gemma was different, Lady Philippa continued. She was his equal in every way. Education, breeding, temperament. They built a partnership on shared ground. What you and Hadrian have is built on imbalance. He holds every advantage. You hold none. When the infatuation fades, and it will fade, what remains? A duke shackled to a maid, and a maid drowning in a world she was never equipped to navigate. I never asked for this, Marin said, her voice barely steady. I didn't plan to feel. I know you didn't. That's what makes it tragic rather than mercenary. But the result is the same. Lady Philippa moved closer. I am not a cruel woman, Miss Lindell, despite what my children believe. I am a practical one. And practically speaking, the kindest thing you can do for my son is leave before this goes further. Before he builds something on you that will collapse when reality reasserts itself. The silence stretched. Marin stared at her hands, folded in her lap, and felt the architecture of hope she'd been constructing dismantle itself brick by brick. If I leave, she said quietly, he'll go silent again. Perhaps. But silence is survivable. A broken heart built on an impossible foundation is not. Lady Philippa placed an envelope on the table. £50. Enough to settle your family comfortably for a year. References for any position you choose. A letter to a colleague in Edinburgh who runs an excellent school and is looking for a literature instructor. Your sister will remain in her current boarding arrangement, fully paid through the end of the year. It was generous, devastatingly generous, the kind of offer designed to make refusal feel selfish rather than principled. I'm not buying you off, Lady Philippa said, reading her expression. I'm giving you what you originally asked for. Security, stability, a future. Without the complication of a relationship that will ultimately cause more pain than happiness. Marin picked up the envelope. It was heavy with possibility. The weight of a different life. A safer life. A life where she didn't lie awake wondering when the fairy tale would collapse and bury her in the rubble. When should I go? She heard herself ask. This morning. Before he wakes. A clean departure is kinder than a prolonged one. Marin stood. Her legs felt hollow, her chest tight with a grief she hadn't earned the right to feel. She was mourning something that had barely existed. A few evenings in a library, a book of Shelley, a kiss in a glass room. She packed in 20 minutes. She left the amber gown, the borrowed accessories, the pins and ribbons Sybil had given her. She kept the Shelley. She couldn't help it. It was the only proof that any of this had been real. She wrote one letter. Not to Sybil, because Sybil would try to stop her. To Hadrian. I'm sorry. Your mother is right about the things I couldn't let myself see. This was always borrowed time, and I've run out of it. Please don't go silent again. The world needs your voice, even if I'm not there to hear it. Morbaji sealed it, left it on her pillow, and walked out of Ashenmere Hall at 6 in the morning, before the servants had finished lighting the fires. The road through the oak corridor felt longer, leaving than it had arriving. She didn't look back. Looking back would have broken something she needed intact to survive the walk. Behind her, the house grew smaller and smaller against the autumn sky, until the trees closed around her and it disappeared entirely, as if it had never existed at all. Home was a rented room above a chandler's shop in Whitechapel, where the walls smelled of tallow and the ceiling leaked when it rained. Marin's father sat by the window in his usual chair, his hands trembling in his lap, watching the street below with the patient detachment of a man who'd made peace with stillness. Nessa was there when Marin arrived, having been sent home from the boarding house by Mr. Pemberton's polite note, explaining that the arrangement had concluded. She was angry in the fierce, protective way of younger sisters who believe love should be simpler than it is. You just left? Without telling him? His mother made it clear. His mother isn't him. You let someone else make your choice, Marin. That's exactly what you've spent your whole life trying to stop doing. The words stung because they were accurate. But accuracy didn't change the mathematics. A duke and a maid. The equation didn't balance, no matter how many poems you stacked on one side. For 5 days, Marin tried to resume her former life. She visited employment agencies. She wrote letters to the Edinburgh school Lady Philippa had mentioned. She read to her father in the evenings, though her voice kept catching on lines that reminded her of firelit libraries and gray eyes. On the 6th day, Sybil appeared. She arrived at the chandler's shop in a hired carriage, wearing a dress that cost more than the entire building, and climbed the narrow stairs with the determination of someone who'd never encountered an obstacle she couldn't simply walk through. "You absolute fool," she said, bursting through the door and embracing Marin simultaneously. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I did what was necessary. You did what Mother told you to do, which is an entirely different thing." Sybil held her at arm's length. "He found your letter, read it once, then locked himself in the library, and hasn't come out in 4 days. He's not eating properly, he's not sleeping, and he's stopped speaking again." The words hit like a physical blow. "That's not my fault." "Of course it's your fault. You're the only person who made him want to speak. You left, and you took his voice with you." Sybil sat on the narrow bed, ignoring its obvious inadequacy. "Mother told me what she did. The envelope, the references, the speech about impossible foundations. Vintage Philippa Voss. She did the same thing to Gemma, you know." Marin stared. "What?" "Before Hadrian married Gemma. Mother tried to pay her off too. Told her she wasn't suitable, that the match would end in misery. Gemma threw the envelope back in her face and told her she'd rather be poor and loved than comfortable and managed. Gemma was a gentleman's daughter. She had standing, connections. Gemma was a country vicar's daughter with no money and ink-stained fingers from writing poetry all day. Mother rewrote history after she died, turned her into a saint of perfect suitability. But the truth is, she was exactly as unsuitable as you, and Hadrian loved her exactly the way he's falling in love with you." Marin's knees gave out. She sat heavily on the room's only chair. "He's not in love with me. He drove to London himself, arrived at my apartment this morning, told me to find you. His exact words were, 'I need her to know that my mother doesn't speak for me. I should have said it myself, and I failed.'" Sybil paused. "He's downstairs, in the carriage. He wanted to come up, but I told him to wait because I thought you'd need a moment to process before facing a duke in your parlor." Marin looked at Nessa, who raised her eyebrows in an expression that clearly said, "If you don't go downstairs right now, I will push you." She went downstairs. Hadrian stood beside the carriage, not inside it. He wore no hat, no gloves, his coat buttoned wrong, his hair disordered. He looked nothing like a duke. He looked like a man who'd spent 4 days in a locked room and then driven through the night. "You left," he said. My mother is afraid. She's been afraid since Gemma died. Afraid of losing me the way she lost her. Afraid that love is just a precursor to devastation. She projected that fear onto you, and I let her because I was afraid too." He stepped closer. "But I'm more afraid of this, of standing in a street in Whitechapel feeling like half of me is missing and knowing exactly where the other half went. Hadrian, I have nothing. I am nothing in your world. You are the only person in my world who has ever felt real." His voice broke on the word. I spent 2 years in silence because nothing felt worth saying. Then you spilled tea on me, and I spoke, and I've been trying to understand why ever since. It's because you were the first person in 2 years who didn't look at me and see a title or a tragedy. You looked at me and saw a man, a broken, difficult, silent man, and you sat across from him in a library and read poetry and let him be exactly what he was. That's not enough to build a life on. It's the only thing worth building a life on. His gaze dropped to the worn satchel at her feet, where the spine of the Shelley was visible, the book she'd taken from Ashenmere, the only thing she'd kept. You left the dresses, the pins, the money, but you kept the poetry. He met her eyes. Do you know what that told me? She shook her head, tears blurring her vision, that you didn't want my money or my house or my position. You wanted the words. You wanted the thing that was real between us. And you left because someone told you it wasn't enough. He stepped closer still. Come back. Not as a companion, not as an arrangement, not as a performance. Come back as yourself, as the woman I want beside me. And let me spend however long it takes proving to you and my mother and every whispering gossip in London that this is real. And Cordelia? Gone. I told her myself, politely, clearly, and in complete sentences. My mother nearly fainted, not from the rejection, but from the quantity of words. Maren laughed. It came out broken and wet, but it was genuine, and the sound of it made something in Hadrian's face transform. Not a smile, not yet, but the landscape shifting, the ice cracking, spring visible beneath. One conversation, she said, echoing words she barely remembered agreeing 2 weeks ago. And then I decide. One conversation, he agreed, but they both knew, standing in that narrow street with the chandler's shop behind them and London sprawling indifferently around them, that the decision had already been made. It had been made in a library over poetry, in the quiet space between 2 people who'd stopped performing and started being real. She went back. Not immediately, and not without conditions. Maren Lindell had learned by now that entering a duke's world without terms was a recipe for erasure, so she set them clearly. She would return as Sybil's companion officially. She and Hadrian would proceed slowly, visibly, honestly. No more pretense, no more performances. If society was going to judge them, it would judge the truth. Lady Philippa resisted. Of course she did. She summoned Maren to the same morning room where she'd delivered the envelope, sat in the same chair, and prepared to deliver the same speech. But this time, Maren spoke first. Your ladyship, I returned your money. I didn't use the references. I'm not here because I need something from your family. I'm here because your son asks me to be, and because I've realized that leaving to protect myself from potential pain is just another way of choosing to be unhappy, only slower. Lady Philippa studied her for a long, suspended moment. Gemma said something similar to me once, she said finally. Almost word for word. I didn't listen then either. And she proved me wrong for 7 beautiful years. She stood. I still think this is reckless. I still think society will be unkind. But I've buried one woman my son loved, and I won't be responsible for driving away another. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't warmth. But it was the door opening a crack wider, and Maren understood that with Lady Philippa, cracks were all you could hope for. The rest had to be earned over time. The weeks that followed were not easy. Cordelia's departure had sent ripples through society, and the whispers about the Duke's mysterious companion intensified. Maren faced scrutiny at every event, the sharp questions, the sidelong glances, the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Some people were kind. The elderly vicar's wife invited her to tea. A young marchioness with a rebellious streak declared her refreshing. But others were cruel in the precise, surgical way that only the privileged can manage. And on those nights, Marin returned to Ashenmere feeling flayed. Hadrian noticed. He always noticed. "You don't have to endure this," he said one evening in the library. Their library, where the fire crackled and the book stood silent, witness to everything that had grown between them. "We can withdraw from society, live here quietly, and let them believe they chased me away? Not a chance." She looked up from her book. "I survived, Mrs. Calder. I survived your mother. I can survive a few gossips with more jewels than empathy." That earned her the rarest thing in the world, a full, genuine, unguarded smile from Hadrian Voss. It transformed his face, broke it open like sunrise after a long night, and Marin stared at it with the wonder of someone witnessing something she'd been told might not exist. "There it is," she whispered. "I knew it was in there somewhere. Don't get accustomed to it. I have a reputation for severity to maintain. Your reputation is already in ruins. You're courting a housemaid. Might as well smile about it." The Thornbury Autumn Ball was the last major event of the season, and all of London knew the Duke of Ashenmere would attend. The speculation had reached fever pitch. Would he bring the companion? Would he finally make a formal declaration? Had Lady Philippa succeeded in ending the scandal, or had the scandal become permanent? Marin dressed in a gown of midnight blue, chosen by Sybil with the strategic precision of a general selecting armor. Simple, elegant, unforgettable. Darcy arranged her hair with the same amber pins from the first dinner party, a small continuity that felt like a talisman. Hadrian met her at the foot of the stairs at Ashenmere. He wore formal black and white, immaculate and commanding, but his eyes when he saw her were anything but controlled. "You look—" He paused, seeming to search for a word adequate to the moment. "If you say appropriate, I'm going back upstairs." I was going to say inevitable. His voice was quiet, like something I should have seen coming from the very beginning. They arrived at the Thornbury Ball together, in the same carriage, with Sybil and Lady Philippa flanking them like a royal guard. The entrance hall buzzed as they were announced. Hundreds of eyes tracked them across the threshold. The whispers began immediately, a rising tide of speculation and judgment. Hadrian offered his arm. Marin took it. They danced. Not the tentative, uncertain dance of the dinner party weeks ago, but something sure and settled. His hand at her waist was steady. Her steps matched his without counting. They moved through the crowd like a conversation made physical. Two people who'd learned each other's rhythms in fire-lit libraries and glass conservatories and narrow streets in Whitechapel. When the waltz ended, Hadrian didn't release her hand. Instead, he turned to face the assembled company, and the room fell silent with the instinctive hush of a crowd, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I have something to say," he said, and the words carried across the ballroom with the force of a man who'd spent 2 years saving up speech for this exact moment. Most of you know me as the Silent Duke. Some of you have speculated about why I stopped speaking, and whether I'd ever start again. The answer to the first question is grief. The answer to the second is standing beside me. The silence was absolute. Marin's heart hammered so violently she was certain the entire room could hear it. Miss Marin Lindell came into my life through an accident. A spilled teacup, a wrinkled carpet edge, the smallest, most mundane catastrophe imaginable. And it changed everything. Not because the tea was important, but because for the first time in 2 years, I saw someone worth speaking to. Someone real. Someone who didn't want my title, or my fortune, or my social utility. Someone who sat in my library and read poetry, and let me be broken until I was ready to be whole again. He turned to her, and his eyes held everything he'd spent months learning to say. Maren Lindell, you are the bravest person I've ever known. You faced my mother, my world, my grief, and my truly abysmal social skills. And you're still here. I don't deserve that. But I'm selfish enough to ask for more. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small box. When he opened it, the ring inside caught the chandelier light, not a diamond, but an amber stone set in gold, warm and unusual, and nothing like what a duke was supposed to offer. I chose amber, he said, because it reminded me of the first time I saw you clearly. In that dress, in that candlelight, when I realized that the most valuable things aren't the ones that glitter the brightest. They're the ones that feel warm when you hold them. Maren couldn't see through her tears. She could barely breathe. The ballroom, the hundreds of watching eyes, the whispers and judgments and social calculations. All of it faded until there was only Hadrian, this impossible, silent, beautiful man who'd learned to speak again because she'd spilled tea on him. Yes, she said, before you even ask properly. Yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and then he kissed her in front of every gossip, every critic, every person who'd ever whispered that a maid had no place in a duke's world. The applause that followed was not unanimous. Some hands remained folded, some faces remained sour, but the sound that rose from that ballroom was warm and real and enough. In the corner, Lady Philippa watched with an expression that her children would later debate for years. Sybil swore she saw a tear. Hadrian maintained it was simply the candlelight. Maren, who'd learned to read the Voss family better than any of them realized, knew it was both. 6 months later, in the library at Ashenmere, their library, Maren found a letter pressed between the pages of the Shelley that Hadrian had given her all those months ago. It was in Gemma's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, and dated a week before the fever took her. To whoever loves him next, he will try to disappear. He will retreat into silence and duty and the cold comfort of control. Don't let him. Pull him back. Make him speak. Make him laugh. Make him feel the terrifying, beautiful weight of being alive. He's worth it. I promise you, he's worth it. Maren held the letter for a long time, sitting in the chair that had become hers, watching the fire die down to embers. When Hadrian found her there, she showed it to him without a word. He read it again, then sat on the floor beside her chair and pressed his face against her hand, and she felt his shoulders shake with the first tears he'd shed in over 2 years. She knew, he said hoarsely. She knew you, Maren whispered. That's all. They stayed there until the fire went cold, her hand in his hair, his grief finally given permission to exist alongside his joy. Not replacing it, not diminishing it, simply coexisting, the way love and loss always do when you're brave enough to hold both. And every year after, on the anniversary of a spilled teacup and a wrinkled carpet edge, the Duke of Ashenmere ordered Earl Grey in the drawing room of whatever house they happened to be visiting. He drank it without incident, and Maren sat beside him, steady and warm and permanent, the amber ring catching the light on her finger like a small sun that never set. The whispers about their marriage never fully stopped, but the whispers, like the tea, eventually went cold. What remained was the warmth. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that doesn't follow the expected path, in characters who choose courage when every voice around them counsels safety, in endings that feel earned because the journey was real. If this story moved you, if a line stayed with you, or a moment made your breath catch, share it in the comments. Your words help me understand what resonates, what lingers, what to create next. Subscribe if you'd like more stories with emotional depth, genuine character growth, and the kind of love that starts with an accident and becomes a choice. Thank you for listening. You make this space what it is.